Anne Boleyn is known for being the first Queen of England to be publicly executed. The charges included adultery and accusations of witchcraft, but modern historians have revealed a much more complex story. In many ways, Anne Boleyn was born to be great. Her father, Thomas Boleyn, was a court favourite of the old King Henry VII, and the Boleyns were one of Britain's top families at the time. In fact, her father was constantly going on diplomatic missions all around Europe as she grew up, and this led Anne to one big date with destiny. In 1513, she took up a position as maid of honour to Queen Mary of France. This was crucial for one simple reason. Queen Mary was none other than King Henry VIII's sister, and Anne was moving closer and closer to his inner circle. With Mary's help, Anne stayed in France for nearly 7 years, soaking in its cosmopolitan culture and turning herself into a refined young woman. When she finally emerged and returned to England, courtiers couldn't believe their eyes. French culture at the time was so liberal, it was almost scandalous, and Anne Boleyn had certainly taken notes. The English were amazed at how exotic and seductive the young woman had become, praising the way she moved right down to the way that she dressed. In particular, Anne had favoured the sleeker French hood as a head covering instead of the more matronly English gable hoods. According to almost everyone who met her, Anne Boleyn was excruciatingly attractive. Slim and dark with long black hair and brown eyes, men thought she was utterly captivating. But not just for her looks alone. Her friends knew her as a lively, quick-witted and charming girl, who was often the smartest person in the room. But underneath that perfect facade, Anne Boleyn was hiding a dark side. Beneath her jovial attitude, she was moody, sharp-tongued, and extremely quick to anger when she didn't get what she wanted. At one point, during an argument with her uncle, she reportedly spoke to him with words that shouldn't be used to a dog. This temper would eventually get her into deep trouble with Henry VIII. But for now, she was getting into an entirely different kind of mess. Her older sister Mary Boleyn was making quite a splash in court and proving herself to be quite the rival to Anne's beauty. Case in point, although Henry was currently married to Catherine of Aragon, he quickly took Anne's sister on as his mistress. But when Anne got to Henry's court, she brought a secret weapon with her, her incredible dancing ability. She became famous for her dancing, and no one seemed to be able to look away. She made a jaw-dropping debut. On March the 4th in 1522, she danced with her sister at a public fete at the royal palace. During the performance, Anne Boleyn vibrated with magnetic new girl energy, and we still have records of how resplendent she looked in a white and gold gown. Except this attracted the wrong kind of attention. The beautiful Anne got scads of admirers after her legendary dance, King Henry included. After all, the king's fling with Mary Boleyn was winding down, and he had a taste for the fresh meat coming from his favourite family. He just couldn't help himself. Which is when Anne dealt the king a legendary snub. She did not go after him. Oh no, she had a much different suitor in mind. At the time, Anne much preferred one of the other gentlemen at court, the dashing Henry Percy, who was the heir to the Earl of Northumberland. Anne poured all of her energy into capturing his heart, not the king's, and the pair had an intense romance together over the next days and weeks. In fact, Anne was so in love with Henry Percy that she made a drastic decision. a decision which would have disastrous consequences down the line. After long engages and letter writing, Anne and her beau Henry Percy couldn't wait anymore and got engaged in secret. And sure, that sounds extra romantic and intimate, but there was a disturbing reason for their secrecy. You see, Percy was already formally engaged to an entirely different woman. As it happened though, that was the least of Anne's problems. Anne and Percy were dumb and in love, but no one else was on their side. His father absolutely refused to support the match, and the young couple also failed to get any marital backing from Cardinal Wolsey, who was an important figure at court. In other words, they were royally screwed. Beaten down, they eventually had to give each other up and went their separate ways. With his rival down and out, King Henry started pursuing Anne in earnest in 1526. Over their courtship, Henry often sent over precious gemstones like pearls and rubies to Anne, as long as he could stash them away from his wife Catherine, of course. But his initial gift really takes the cake. His very first letter included an elegant gold bracelet that was set with his own portrait. Maybe the narcissism had turned Anne off, because she sure did not react well. While Henry was throwing every trick in the book at her, she was still not interested. In fact, Anne specifically refused to bed him. And even when Henry promised that he would promote her from a regular side piece to his chief mistress, she still turned him down. Anne's rejection of one of the most powerful men in Europe might seem bizarre, until you dig a little deeper. You see, Anne wanted to be much more than just a mistress. She wanted Henry to annul his marriage to Catherine of Aragon and make her queen. And she was certainly playing her cards right. The more hot and bothered Henry was, the more he would be putty in her hands. As it turned out, Anne's timing in courting Henry was impeccable. When she arrived on the scene, Henry's marriage was majorly on the rocks. For one, although Queen Catherine had given birth to Princess Mary, the aging woman hadn't given Henry his much-coveted male heir. But there was an even bigger issue, one Anne would take full advantage of. While she was denying Henry in the bedroom, he started to get deranged ideas. He decided that since Queen Catherine had been briefly married to his older brother Prince Arthur before the prince died, God was somehow mad at him for stealing his brother's wife. Very logically, this was why he didn't have a son. And while Catherine swore she never consummated the union, it was just no good. Henry started angling for an annulment, which was the only way the Catholic Church would condone him remarrying Anne Boleyn. When Henry started talking about chucking Catherine out the door, Anne was absolutely thrilled. Although she still kept Henry away from her bed, she happily accepted his proposal of marriage. And while he was, already married, the two of them assumed it would be a snap of the finger to oust Queen Catherine. This infamously did not end well. Surprising exactly 0 people, the public did not take well to the idea of her becoming queen. After all, the common crowds absolutely adored Catherine and blamed Anne for splitting the marriage apart. As Anne rose in power, the grumblings only got louder, with people calling her cruel names and accusing her of beguiling Henry with witchcraft. It all climaxed with a terrifying event. One evening after Anne dined near the Thames River, she got the shock of her life. As she was heading outside, a mob of angry women attacked her, convinced that she was bringing their king and country to ruin. A terrified Anne had to make a narrow escape on a boat to save herself from their rage. It was all finally at a fever pitch until King Henry made a fateful decision that would change the country forever. After 7 long years of fighting with the church, the king had had quite enough, and his actions ended up changing history. He infamously split from the Roman Catholic Church entirely and installed himself as the head of the brand new Anglican Church. In 1533, it finally happened. After many machinations and even more years, Anne Boleyn became Queen Consort of England, marrying Henry on January 25th. But even after this great victory, Anne couldn't resist getting that last bit of revenge and really rubbing it in Catherine's face. She made sure her coronation day outdid the former queen's. Starting on June 1st in 1533, the event lasted 4 glorious days, with Anne wearing a series of covetable outfits the entire time. On the last day, Anne one-upped herself and wore an unforgettable gown dyed royal purple and topped with ermine. Now, everyone knew that she had a pretty twisted sense of humor, and once she became queen, she put it on full display. In reaction to the many angry protests against the king choosing her as his queen, she temporarily took this phrase as her motto. Grumble all you like, this is how it's going to be. By this point, Anne was pregnant, Queen of England, and more powerful and smug than she had ever been before. In other words, there was nowhere to go but down. After her coronation, Anne settled into royal life and prepared to give King Henry his long-desired son. And indeed, all signs pointed to a boy. Almost all of the king's astrologers said the stars mapped out a male heir, and Anne and Henry were also confident that they were about to welcome a son. Instead, Anne was entering into a horrible nightmare. In September of 1533, she gave birth to a healthy child, but not a boy. She had a little girl, the future Queen Elizabeth I, and the shock sent the royal couple into a tailspin. Henry cancelled his celebratory It's a Boy jousting match, and the royal scribes hastily changed prince to princess in their official announcement. Anne didn't know it then, but it was the beginning of the end. When she didn't immediately give Henry a male heir, his patience with his testy wife went right down the drain. He started to resent her sharp intelligence and even sharper tongue, demanding that she submit to him as a wife, not as his equal. Over the next 3 years, Anne became pregnant numerous times, but each time it tragically ended in a miscarriage. All the while, Henry grew ever more distant and ever more regretful that he had married her in the first place. But by then, there were even darker problems at play. The king had always had a wandering eye, and when his marriage to Anne started fraying, he turned his attentions elsewhere, namely to the pretty, sweet, and comparatively submissive Jane Seymour, who would eventually become his third wife. Oh, and here's an icky detail. Jane was also Anne's second cousin. So clearly Henry was a little obsessed with their family. But despite their family ties, Anne and Jane weren't exactly close. More than that, Anne was no dummy. She knew that a relationship was growing between Henry and Jane right under her nose. Apparently, one day at court, Jane started brazenly opening and shutting the offending locket right in front of Anne. Once she realized what was going on, Anne furiously tore the chain so violently that she cut her fingers open. Only Jane wasn't done shoving the affair into Anne's face. One evening, Anne walked into a room only to find her treasonous cousin sitting prettily on her husband's lap. Her response went down in infamy. Giving into her notorious temper, she reportedly flew into a very public rage at the sight of Jane Seymour lounging atop the king. Shortly afterwards, Anne miscarried yet again, losing the child she was so desperate to give Henry. But that's not even the most harrowing part. When the attendants looked at the infant, they saw that it was a boy. When Henry VIII turned on Anne Boleyn at last, his spite was swift and brutal. People say they go the same way that they came, and nothing could be truer when it came to Henry. In fact, he pulled the exact same move on Anne that he had for Catherine. Within days of losing his narcissistic love for Anne, Henry had installed Jane in the royal quarters. With this done, he worked on the bloodiest phase of his plan. The king detained and questioned a series of male courtiers who knew Anne, and accused them of sleeping with his wife. Chillingly, Henry even took in Anne's brother George, accusing him of having romantic relations with his own sister. In mid-May, Anne was finally put on trial. While she stood there with her brother George, suffering through a similar trial on the same day, the Crown accused her of everything from witchcraft to plotting Henry's death so that she could remarry. By then, it was far too late for rebuttals. A jury of 27 people found Anne guilty on all counts and condemned her to execution. But one detail of her trial is gut-wrenching. As Anne looked into the jury's eyes, she saw a familiar face, that of Henry Percy, her old love and the man she tried to marry all those years ago. You know, before King Henry pulled her into his destructive orbit. Even more disturbingly, the jury's decision was unanimous, which meant that Percy had personally sent his old flame to the block. The decision to execute Anne absolutely destroyed him. When an aide read out the decree, Anne's ex-fiancé was so overcome with emotion he collapsed on the floor, and was so out of it that attendants needed to haul him out of the room. He never got over the shock either. He passed childless a mere 8 months later. In her final days in the Tower, visitors to the Queen of England described her as eerily calm and even happy. Perhaps this is why she uttered some utterly chilling last words. She reportedly was chatting with a guard about her professional executioner, and in an attempt to reassure him, she said, "I hear that he's quite good, and I have a very small neck." On May 19th, 1536, Anne Boleyn walked to her own execution. Even as she awaited the executioner's blade, she never once put King Henry in a bad light, nor did she admit to any guilt. She had yet another cunning but selfless reason for this. At this point, Anne likely didn't want any of her family to suffer more if Henry tried to punish her long after she was gone. And as Anne's last seconds came, she maintained this composure. Anne Boleyn even died in her own style. While her ladies wept around her, she got them to tie a blindfold around her eyes and then knelt in front of the block. This was a classically French style of execution. Anne had prepared every last detail, and now it was time to face her end. As it turned out, King Henry's swordsman was worth his pay rate. It took only a single stroke to behead the Queen of England. But that didn't quite mean that she was gone. Henry tried his best to forget Anne, fully establishing Jane Seymour in the palace just 11 days after the execution. But it wasn't that simple. In fact, Henry had such a difficult time erasing Anne Boleyn's memory that he soon had all likeness of her destroyed, and there are no contemporary paintings of her in existence. So in the end, whether he loved her or hated her, it wasn't easy for the king to forget the woman that was Anne Boleyn. Thanks for watching History Exposé. If you love uncovering the best stories in history, hit like and subscribe to keep exploring with us. Don't forget to visit our main page, Factinate, for more incredible facts about everything.